for my first podcast ever.
Mine too.
I think it's super on brand just from like what I know about you of kind of one, the company, but even more so about the mental side and like the mental awareness and the kind of the full scope of your company. And I kind of want to back into that first before we go into TARFORM and more of, you know, the ethos of the company, maybe a little bit more about yourself. And obviously I'll, you know, give the intro later, but yourself on kind of like what your bigger why, like why, what makes you who you are, and then how did the bigger why go further into the what, which you now have turned into an e-bike, but you've had several whats. You did have a mental health company, you've had a few different startups. So what's your why that you continue to uncover that then brings you to these whats, which are the company?
Many questions. Should we end up with the why or begin with the what? What comes first? I don't know if I don't think my why is still fully uncovered. I think that's a process that you go through until the end. Hopefully, you know, somewhere along the path, you're like, that why becomes a bit clear. But yeah, kind of high level. I grew up in Sweden to Russian parents, so totally different cultures, which I think is basically, it gives you different perspectives. I realized later, not when you're growing up. You know, when you're growing up, you're either want to belong to this camp or the other one. But further down the life, I realized that was an advantage. But you know, growing up in Scandinavia, it's an interesting culture in terms of sort of the knowledge around the environment and typically a higher sense of awareness around what the field of sustainability today, right?
So do you think that a lot of that came from, I mean, your parents, I believe, were entrepreneurs. So one, the idea that you want to start from scratch, but even more so, was it that you were exposed to sustainability? So you just by default knew that whatever you would start or the product you'd bring into the world should have the backbone of sustainability? Or do you think that, as you're saying, it's kind of uncovered the more and more you were working with motorcycles and you were seeing the flaws in sustainability, you were seeing not the closed loop systems where you like, I need to bring this into the world. Like, I guess I'm trying to get down to the point of what was the chicken and the egg, that you wanted to create this sustainable product, or you wanted to create a product and therefore realized it had to be sustainable?
Yeah, no, it was never driven by sustainability to begin with, because I really had no frame of reference of what sustainability even meant before moving to the United States and seeing what sustainability is not. And, you know, just seeing how all the garbage ends up on the streets to begin with, and nothing is being recycled. So I remember that about 10 years ago was kind of like, oh, wow, okay, so other countries are not doing what Sweden does, which imports more garbage than they have. Like their garbage refineries or recycling facilities run at such high efficiency that they're actually importing garbage. So I guess that was, you know, one of the first realizations. And then at the same time, sort of really got interested in design early on, and gravitated towards what does aesthetics mean on a bigger spectrum than just making something pretty and beautiful, which I think now, I think design has to take a little bit of a different role, as not just being considered sort of a superficial thing, but how can we start using design or beauty and get people to think in a little bit different ways? And I think that in combination with sustainability drove me to start my design agency, which actually is called Gravity Hill, which we started 12, 13 years ago. So gravity is a common denominator, yeah. And so basically what we wanted to do is, you know, how do we use design as a driving force to tell a bigger story in the way we design products, not just you know, hardware products, but whenever you create something that serves a function to communicate something that, you know, is a little bit on a bigger perspective than just, oh, here's the functionality and you know, let's build a productivity app or something like that. But how do we begin rethinking, you know, what are the challenges we should be addressing as a society? And there's plenty of them.
I think this is a perfect segue to kind of, tie everything together. Why I didn't want to start with that you have this, electric bike company, because I think it's my favorite part about the company way more than the product is the culture around it, everything that you're touching upon, like the narrative, the storytelling, and it probably comes from your background of a design company. But I think, can you speak a little bit more to that? Where, and we'll get into, the bike is extreme, all those that are listening, it's an extremely cool product. Check it out. When you're in Brooklyn, definitely go to the showroom as well. But more so of like this culture and your core values that is your why, it's sounding like, that then birth the what, which is the product. So kind of go more into the culture. What does it mean? Why closed loop, and how does that really align with you personally?
Mhm.
And why it's important to tell kind of a story. I think you had a quote too, what was it? The people want to use their products that represent their values. I think that right there says your larger offering of the culture versus just, another product into the world.
Yeah, good question. And that was also a process of seeing what doesn't work, and working with other startups. And basically my role was to work with early stage founders, and typically, they had a napkin sketch idea and said, this is something we want to build. And my agency came in and helped define the story, the brand identity, the visuals, down to the first sort of iteration of the product. And most often you sort of dive head in and start building the product. And then after that, the company says, well, we also need to create a brand identity. We need to create brand communication. And initially, I was just following the step-by-step of, okay, here's a visual identity, here's a logotype, and so on. But then realized that after the product was launched or the company was launched, there was a lot of focus on just selling the service or product. And it lost half of the meaning, because it was primarily driven by profit. And then after working with 20-30 startups, I started thinking, well, there's something that doesn't work here. So a lot of companies want this thing that they call brand. What does that even mean? Brand seems to be some sort of this magical unicorn that is intangible. It's hard to grasp, but yet we all hear the meaning of a brand and the value of a brand. Nike, Coca-Cola. It's there's billions have been invested into instilling some sort of purpose into it. So that kind of gave me a realization. Well, is there another way to create a product or a service or a company, and not start with the product, but start with the why, which is, what is your purpose? What is your mission? And work your way backwards. And many times companies, they build a product and then they say, well, can you tell me what my company should stand for? And it's almost like, you go to someone and say, can you help me tell me what I should stand for? So if you're starting a company, you should have very clear ideas of what is your mission? What are your values? What do you stand for? And kind of looking at the space of tech, I felt there's a lot of work to be done here in terms of changing priorities of why we start companies to begin with. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, it was sort of a fusion between my personal passion, which was machines and design. And I was building vintage bikes at a shop out in Brooklyn. So I felt, okay, here's a thing that I don't seem to get bored of. Can I combine that with a greater sense of purpose and impact? And looking at the mobility space, transportation is the biggest fossil fuel emitters. So, okay, why not address that as a challenge? And at the same time, do something that is at a big scale, but sort of honor the passion behind it. And the first thing I did is I essentially identify what do we stand for? What would TARFORM have as foundational values? And that became sort of the platform. And it was really important to not compromise the integrity of that, because it's so easy to write down 3 words on a keynote and like, oh, they sound pretty, but what does that actually mean? And the greatest challenge I realized is to actually staying true to those values and honoring them throughout the whole process. which is not easy.
To get inventive to, I mean, maybe talk a little bit more of how you've had to fully create your own materials and going everything from, algae, I think it's siding or paint, and flaxseed, hardening your seats. Like you truly are inventing this product one by one to stay to your core values of sustainability. So maybe talk about that and it's, often headaches of the supply chain and having to create something from scratch, and especially during a pandemic and inflation and all sorts of issues that aren't on your side right now.
Yeah, it was a good challenge for sure. And most of it was driven by my unawareness of what the hell I was even doing. Yeah, so those three words, I'm like, okay, art. I think as a society, we're kind of beginning to lose appreciation to everyday objects, because most of the objects around us are made for mass manufacturing, mass standardization, mass production. So there seems to be this movement towards back to arts and crafts, which is, we appreciate things that are handmade.
Yep.
We appreciate things that are beautiful, that are when someone has dedicated a lot of time making it. So that felt like such an obvious, cornerstone, especially coming from sort of the custom motorcycle world, where you spend 6 months building this object. That became one of the sort of pillars. The second is technology. Obviously, looking at the tech space that we inhabit now, infinite possibilities, everything from additive manufacturing to sensor technology, AI. Of course, building something that's zero emissions was a no-brainer. We would not, create a company that used internal combustion as an engine. And then lastly is looking at how are we actually building products today. So typically, manufacturers don't really speak about the materials that they use, because it's for a reason. Mainly, they don't want the consumer to know the toxic materials that are being used in the process, nor the philosophy behind making vehicles specifically. So most products today are built to be replaced. And if you look at vehicles from the 40s, 50s, a lot of them were built to be repaired. So kind of looking at the landscape, I'm like, okay, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't work here. So instead of just making something electrical, could we address this as a holistic approach and kind of try to figure out all of these building blocks? And it just felt right. If we're going to pick one of the things with the direction to do something impactful and good, then we have to address all of them. Otherwise, it wouldn't be really authentic for us to say, oh, well, we're trying to build a sustainable company, but then we use petroleum-based plastics. And, by sort of planting that flag, no idea how difficult it would actually be to stay true to those values. And we did really the best we could under 5 years. And, the more we sort of started scratching on the surface and say, well, what does it mean to use sustainable materials? And realizing that most of the stuff that goes into a vehicle today is incredibly toxic. Everything from petroleum-based plastics, vinyls, wiring. And we said, okay, let's bite off what we can chew and begin sort of reinventing what we can reinvent. We can't obviously create a zero waste product from the start. So we chose, okay, let's look at some of the key materials that we can start swapping out and looking at what other materials are currently existing, and essentially creating a path that, this is a decision matrix that we filter all the decisions through. And if they get us closer to the goal, amazing. And how long it's going to take us for us to get there, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years. But it was just important to sort of constantly ping and balance that and realize, or kind of to promote the new industry that's happening in biotech and sustainability and all of that.
But I think you're constantly going back to your touchstone, which are your core values, right? Because if you weren't going back to your core values, you would just assume, well, I'll just, take this plastic component and we'll just use that because it's easier. We're on a time crunch. And so I think that going back to like your moral compass are the core values. And I think the more you're speaking, it's funny when you said you didn't know your personal why. I'm hearing the personal why come through the lens of your company, which I think just shows how intertwined that they are, that it's really a symbiotic. You're not just creating something that you and yourself use, it's a representation of you as a person and individual too. And so I think your core values of your company and your core values of you are actually really, really, really similar. Yeah, I think a lot of it too of, just a lot of the tribulations that you've gone through, if you weren't so committed to the overall circular economy, not just how the product's made, not just the narrative of the story to make sure it matches, but then even how the product essentially goes into its next life, right? And breaks down and goes into its next life. And very, very, very few companies are taking that extra effort to really look about what is this going to become 30 years from now? They're just so focused on oversupply and, this over consuming culture that we're in. And so I really admire that you are kind of creating that standard. And I would love to see it almost standardized across multiple industries where the new ledger isn't your ROI, but it's, your carbon footprint. Like, how can you, be a front runner to really show that, whether it's investors or whether it's just the gauge of how companies are graded, how can they be graded off of like their actual closed loop model, right? It'd almost be a subtraction grade. Like it'd be like the negative emissions as a grade versus the pluses. So I think you're really like paving the way for that. And it says,
you're absolutely right. And that was well said, because I think there's a lot of buzzwords and, the regenerative economy, circular economy, and so on. And that is the consequence of what we should have been doing from the start. And a lot of that is just pure common sense. Right.
Well, and I would almost say a lot of it's loosely said. People would love to use the buzzwords and packaging that they're a closed economy, but when push comes to shove, they're not going to go and invent a siding out of flaxseed and fail until they figure it out like you have. I think they like to say that they do, but for you to constantly go back to, again, your core values of what you stand for, and you won't, put the product out until you fully believe that it falls within the lines of what you represent. So I cut you off, but more so I think a lot of people do this like greenwashing or this false advertisement of a lot of these, and it's showing your dedication to actually following through with it, which says a lot. But carry on. I interrupted you with the
no interruption. I mean, it's a free flow back, but I agree. What doesn't do the industry any service is companies who want to ride, the green wave and just slap a sticker on their product, say we're bio something, and most consumers don't have enough depth to truly understand what are the ingredients that goes into a product, because nobody's really educating us, and typically what manufacturers are doing is pointing the fingers towards the consumer and say, you should be green, you should recycle, you should do that. So they're kind of trying to relieve their sense of responsibility and push it on the end consumer
after
and say,
after the product's made. But how
after
much
the product's made, exactly.
How much the pressure is really put on to making this so it does recycle, so this doesn't go into a landfill. But then all the pressure is put on me as a consumer to make sure I do the right thing in its afterlife, which isn't right. So I think be a lot more pressure put on companies and the manufacturers and the creators like yourself, like you're paving the way to make sure that the product is just sustainable to begin with.
And it has to be a dialogue. It has to be dialogue between anyone who chooses to bring something physical into the world. It's not a nice thing to be sustainable. It is your responsibility. If you go and extract raw material from Earth, find a way that it goes back there. Maybe it's going to take 5 or 10 years, but have that in mind when you're even, starting with the first pencil sketch. Figure out, how does this thing return to where I took it from? This is pretty self-evident, right? But we've created sort of a modern economy on a notion of infinite growth based on a finite amount of resources, hoping that tech is going to solve it. But maybe it will. I don't see enough, or I don't see the pace of those innovations happening at the rate they should be.
Yep. Well, unfortunately, I feel like it's going to have to be some sort of consequence, whether it's a tax or whether that you're held at this different way as a company, that your wrist is slapped and you're reprimanded to then go and do the right thing, unfortunately. Otherwise, just financially, we're seeing it right now with sustainable materials. Unfortunately, for the good moral reason, people aren't choosing that way at a mass scale in big industries. And so it will be, the next 10 years are going to be really, really interesting as, climate change increases and products get more strict. It'll be wild to see what that looks like. But I didn't want to focus on the company. I think what your company is rad and I admire it so much, but I really wanted to unpack more on like you and as the individual and kind of what makes up your psyche, that again, your why that then creates the what of your company. But and that just falls in line with, I think, the consciousness of what Gravity, at least the podcast, and what Brett, the founder, really represents is what is, your purpose? What's, the cheesy, what's your reason to get out of bed in the morning, or what's your why? That I think if you tell that story, that impacts people a lot more than this manicured product of kind of sharing your bigger why. And then that inspires the next person to go create their why. And I think that cycle is like the beautiful thing of sharing your purpose. And so to kind of back into it, we can, have free form, but to back into it, I'm a big believer of your worldview usually being shaped by like 3 or 4, let's call them like, in the biography of your life, like 3 or 4 massive chapters, whether it's the who's, maybe it's the what's or the wins, like what are the 3 or 4 pivotal moments that you reflect on that you're like, this is how I shaped my worldview, personally, spiritually, like emotionally, like what do you think are like the 3 things that have really kind of put this parameters around like you as the person?
Okay, I gotta dig deep, or I should have thought about them before. Top 3, okay. One of my biggest influences was most likely, or probably, or definitely martial arts. So I grew up doing a range of different styles like karate, kung fu, and it wasn't just a way to move your body, it was also philosophy. And I was fortunate to get introduced to that when I was 6. So I think a lot of my worldviews were founded there, which is, looking at sort of the rhythmical flow of energy, whether it's in your body or they say chi, which is a concentration of your energy. And when I was a kid, I wasn't really reflecting over that from sort of a philosophical standpoint. It was just, oh, okay, cool, here's a Japanese word, without fully understanding what it means. But knowing that was sort of shaping my way of being, and a lot of that was also.
How was it introduced to you? Like, was it a certain individual? Did you stumble upon it? Did you seek it out? Like, how do you think that crossed your radar?
So I started by my dad brought a Bruce Lee movie when I was 6 years old, and I just saw the movie. I'm like, wow, that's cool. I want to do that. And then a week later, he took me to a karate class, and I was just hooked, And then I started teaching when I was 15 or 16 years old, and the more you sort of get into that, the more you have to understand the underlying principles of it, and not just execute certain shapes. And a lot of it was rooted in Zen Buddhism, which is a completely different way of perceiving reality than we're typically taught in the West. But at the same time, I was growing up in Sweden, with Russian parents, so I had these completely 3 different perspectives, and nothing made any sense, which forced me to go out and kind of constantly weigh things against each other and say, well, these guys are saying one thing, these guys saying some direct opposition. So what is truth? And I think in a way that led me to a process of self-discovery, to kind of not just take things at face value, not to say, oh, excellent, this is this religion that dictates this and my way of being, and here's something else, but rather to absorb that information in a non-judgmental way and figure out what makes sense to you. And I think that was a big realization later on, without me even knowing that this was happening in the background. Second was probably well, my dad was an entrepreneur, so he was constantly starting new companies and new ideas. And typically, the Swedish population is, a lot of people are doing the same thing, at least when I was growing up. So they have a very strong middle class. There's not a lot of, variation between entrepreneurs and people at the bottom. It was basically like the solid level, So my dad was different because he was doing different things. And I think that gave me an insight early on that, oh, wait, I don't have to work this job like everyone else does. I don't have to do things 9 to 5. I can do and build whatever I want to do. And so that kind of shaped my curiosity. And well, if I were to start a company, what would it be? Would it be based on, business model to generate profit and revenue? I felt that never resonated with me. I was always driven by, oh, here's a cool thing I want to make. And that led me sort of into the field of design and furniture and just creating something. It just made me feel like amazing. Your heart beats faster. I'm like, wow, you can make things with your hand. So that became such a fundamental way of expressing yourself in any medium, whether it was digital or physical. And then thirdly, I think it was understanding the mechanism of your inner workings, which is in there, which is basically the field of psychology and philosophy, And I remember stumbling over a book when I was 16 by Napoleon Hill from like 1908. Do you remember the name of the book?
I cannot. I knew you were going to say it. I'm like, please say it. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I know exactly.
Yes, it's on the tip of my tongue. And I haven't read it since.
Yeah.
But basically what he did, he studied Henry Ford.
Yeah, exactly.
And as a 16-year-old, I'm reading this book. I'm like, wait, there's a secret to success? What is the secret? And he followed, some of the most successful people on from that age. I think it was Dale Carnegie, Henry Ford, and that felt like such a mystical thing that there's a framework to operate it. And what separates people who achieve what they set out to achieve, to fulfill their dreams, whatever, versus the vast majority that never get to that point. And that sort of like opened up completely new door where I started consuming everything I could on personal development, on philosophy, and trying to map out your mind essentially.
I love that. It's funny to see all three of them intertwined. It's almost like you had that initial spark of what your flow state felt like, essentially with martial arts, right? Like, okay, I'm in this, I can do this forever. Oh, here's my dad as an example of like failing fast. It's right there in front of me. Every night I come home, I see it. So you have that live example. And then your world was cracked open with the book and, kind of seeing this higher level of consciousness. You're like, all right, I've got this roadmap now. It's been done before. How can I innovate? And I think they all kind of go hand in hand. That's beautiful. That's awesome. So now the harder question, I think, is,
thanks for what do you call it? Shining light on it. I'm like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, I can totally unpack your whole brain. Absolutely. Now kind of going into like, that's kind of what the journey that got you there, but what do you think, like your secret sauce? Obviously everybody has their journey, but what's your secret sauce? Like what's your biggest skill sets that makes you this serial entrepreneur and this, constant inventor and creator? And then the double-edged sword of like, what are your biggest weaknesses, as a startup entrepreneur that's go and constantly evolving and innovating? Like, what do you think is your biggest, I don't want to say distractions, but like your Achilles heel, as a creator? What do you often find? And you and I personally talked about this, you find the teammates that can then pick up those skill sets. But what say your largest strengths? So here's your personal journey that you went on, paired with your best strengths as you as an individual, and then where do you even it out with some of your weaknesses that you've acknowledged?
Yeah, the strength, which I think I've had even at a younger age, is not to see limitations in things, but see the possibility. So there's always, again, different ways of looking at things. And what I notice most often when people are faced with a challenge or a task, they tend to gravitate towards, oh, this is difficult. Here are the reasons why it's not possible, and then you create sort of your worldview around that thing. And I could never really understand it. I don't know if it's a genetic or a socially conditioned thing. I always saw, oh, if that's never been done before, I lean into it. That makes me interested. I'm like, well, there's got to be a way to do it in that case. And then you sort of change the context and start figuring out what are all the possibilities that would make this happen. And obviously, you know, you're aware of the limitations, but you focus on what you choose to focus on. And maybe this is something, yeah, I think for sure, I think it. And this is something that I believe can be cultivated with a lot of people. And I think root of this is our educational system, which really doesn't teach us that. It usually teaches us information, memory.
6-hour podcast on our educational system.
Yeah, that's another rabbit hole. We're going to dive into that.
Yeah.
Limitation, I would say, is limitation, I would say, is patience. Because when you create something, you want to create it and you want to have a tangible result. But that's something I've for sure learned to hone, because I've been working on this for 5 years, and that's a long time to work on anything, you know, and endless hours. So that has been the greatest lesson, is just you know, have a sense of urgency, but let things take the time they have to take, and just trust the process.
Yep, I think that's great. I mean, I'm kind of already at my last question, which is a long one, but what I know, I mean, you are it sounds like you're, you know, constantly curious, and like it sounds like a student for life. Like just from, you know, what I know about you, you're constantly wanting to dive in and learn more constantly, whether it impacts the company or just at large. But like, what would you say you are most, and maybe it is going back to your company and growing your company, which we can talk about in a second, of its, you know, continual evolution, but what are you most excited about right now in the world, in maybe your life, in where the company's at? Like, what just like that you can't get off your mind and you're just so stoked about and wanting to, if there were you know, infinite hours in a day, you'd want to just fully go into this or learn more about? And please don't say the metaverse.
Yeah, definitely not in the metaverse. I mean, we build vehicles to help people remind that there's a physical reality. And on the contrary, like how do you know, reawaken that sense of, oh, I'm alive and I exist in this plane? And how do you sort of stimulate those senses, and not through, you know, mobile devices? I think right now we're at this pivotal moment as a society where we really have to choose the direction. And what seems to be the narrative is that we have to become more of a technological being, where we completely focus on the ones and zeros, which at the same time creates this completely other community of people who say, no, we should go completely the other way. We should go back to being tribal and live in the woods and so on. And that creates more tension. Mm-hmm. I think the way is like anything else in nature, is to find a balance between both, and not totally become technological, and not completely go back to just living, you know, out in huts, but find a middle ground. And it's a new field that's being created.
So to boil it, like, you're excited about this like median between the digital and physical, or you're excited to see technology continue to seep into the physical world? Like, how are you to say like one, you know, subject that you are excited about? Or you could just be excited about some book you're reading or some show you're watching. Like, what are you most excited about as far as like right now? Like, what's your number one, you know, pop culture, not, I don't want to say pop culture, your number one thing that your idle mind draws to when it can?
No, I'm excited about exactly the merger of technology and nature. And that field is it's called biotech, which is how do we observe nature's intelligence and then use that wisdom to create technology for the better. And it's so new, and it has so much potential. And I think in there maybe lies the answer of how do we build a more sustainable, and that can be expressed in so many different ways. It can be expressed in architecture, in vehicles, in fashion, and a little bit find our roots, but also create a positive future.
Yep, that's exciting. And you are doing that through your company every day. So it's directly aligned when you go to work every day, you're working on it.
Yes.
So that's awesome. What else? Anything else I didn't really touch on? Any other more kind of like your big core values, mental health, your purpose? They're all huge, super deep subjects, but anything we didn't get a chance to talk about?
Well, speaking on the theme of sort of entrepreneurship, if you would to go out and create something, which I really endorse everyone to, even if it's a side project, like, go and do something, and do something that you believe is a step in the right direction, because everyone's effort is needed now. And most people say, well, what can I do? I have no impact. But even the tiniest little pebble creates ripples. So pick something and just address that head on. But start with maybe what you started with. Start with your why. Why are you doing this? Does this thing even need to exist?
Yeah, I think that's really important. At the end of the day, we are all individuals, insularly focusing on a collective whole. And so I think if we are aligned with our purpose, what's our community that now of like-minded people that we attract? What's that greater purpose? And then therefore, what's the impact, on the world? And I believe you referenced it once before of like and even back to the metaverse or NFTs, or so much of this technology now is going towards these really innovative ways, but is there true direct impact for the greater whole, for the planet, for the people, for, I think the collective? And it's crazy to see, and we also don't want to, put words in people's core value mouths that needs to be their mission. But if you were to really start from your personal core values, not just to create a company for a return and to be sold, but if you're really to go to what wakes you up in the morning and how do you function in your flow state, it would be wild to see how much of these companies and what they would actually create, right?
Yeah, exactly. And identify your flow state. Yeah. Go and experiment. Like figure out what makes you go up in the morning. And if you feel that calling, then go for it. And everyone has that. There's this dormant seed of potential that figure it out.
But I think going back to like what your sculpted your worldview, if you don't, I think your dad was such a huge role in that, because if you don't have an example in front of you, and maybe you can, there's been Michael Jordan never played basketball, never knew it. Nobody was in front of him to teach him that. So I think there's something about seeing that representation in front of you so you can kind of learn the ways is helpful, even if it's an entirely different product, but just understanding that you could be an outlier or a differentiator in some way helps. So it's kind of that perfect recipe of, okay, like what's my spark? What do I get excited about? Or your flow state, which is my core values. Okay, how can I see it applied in the real world? And then, almost even to your case, okay, how can I learn more and more and more on how to do this? And so it would, just to tie a bow on it, going back to that education comment, it would be so incredible if that's how education was really taught, or if that offering was out there of like going to you as the individual of what makes you tick versus like what's that overarching or like mass way in a way to think or to have a career or to be successful.
Yeah. There is a manual, and it's partially you write it, but the other part is already there. You just have to go through the process of unbecoming and getting rid of the institutional programming that we have unfortunately bathed in.
Yep, it's a lot of backtracking, or as Brett likes to always tell me, it's a lot of surrendering, which is tough for type A control freaks. I don't know any of them at all, but it's tough. It's tough for them.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that's all I have. Really, really appreciate it. I will definitely give more information on the company at large, but I wanted to dig into kind of your psyche today and, talk more as like what makes an entrepreneur and what makes you tick. So I think this was really insightful. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you. Happy to share. Thanks, Brianna.